Hello everyone, in this video we're going to look at the difference between static and instance. So in particular the difference between static and instance variables. And to demonstrate this we're going to create a simple circle class. And the idea here is that each circle has a radius. So when we create objects, circle objects, each object gets its own radius. However, we also have a static variable that keeps track of the number of objects we've created. So let's get started. Over in Eclipse, I've created a new project called Static vs Instance, and I've also created a new class called Circle2, which is at the moment completely empty. So, I'm just going to start this off. Public class Circle2. Okay, now, if we were going to write a circle class, which we are, I guess the important feature of a circle that we care about is the radius, okay? We need to know how big the circle is. So we're going to declare a double called radius. And this is going to be an instance variable. Now what that means is that each object gets its own copy of this variable. So each object can have its own value for radius. We're also going to have a static variable, which counts the number of objects that we have. So static, we use the keyword static to do this. It's going to be an int, and we'll call it number of objects. And we'll initialize this to 0, actually. Okay, so the idea here is that each object gets its own copy of radius, but number of objects is shared between all of the objects of our class. It actually, where radius belongs to the object, number of objects belongs to the class. There's only ever one copy of it, no matter how many objects we've created, or even if we haven't created any objects yet. And we'll see how this works in just a second. So, next thing we're going to do is have a constructor. So circle2, and this would just be a default constructor with no parameters. What we're going to have here is just set the radius to something kind of meaningful. So in our example, we're going to have radius equals 1.0. Just give radius a value of 1. And we're also going to increment the number of objects, plus plus. And that can be our default constructor. Now, we'll also create another constructor which takes a parameter. So circle2, and it's going to take a double called new radius. Now, in this constructor, what we're going to do is set the circle's radius to this value here. So radius equals new radius. And again, we're going to increment number of objects. Number of objects plus plus. Okay, so what we're going to do next is have a couple of methods to make this class a bit more useful. The first thing we're going to do is create a static method that's going to return an int, and it's going to be called get number of objects. And it's simply going to return the number of objects. Number of objects. The next thing we're going to do is create a method that calculates the area of our circle. So this is going to return a double, and we'll call it get area. Now the reason this isn't a static method is because we want the area to be calculated using our object's radius. In other words, this is an instance method. Has no parameters. And how do we calculate the area of a circle? Well, it's just the radius multiplied by the radius multiplied by pi, or pi r squared, as I learnt at school. So return radius times math.pi. And that's it. So that really is the basics of all we need for a circle class. So what we can do now is create a main method to test this. So main method public static void main string array args. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is call this method here before we've even created any objects. So we're going to have a print line statement, number of objects, and then we'll concatenate the number of objects. Now, because this is a static method, we use the class name when we call it. So circle dot get number of objects. Now what we'll have is, let's create an object. So we'll tell system.out.println creating an object, So we're going to create a new circle object, so circle2, and we'll call this C1 equals new circle2, and we'll just use the default constructor here. Alright, so now let's print out the number of objects again, and then we'll create another one. So I'm just going to copy all three of these lines of code and paste them, creating another object. We'll call this one C2, and we'll print out the number of objects again. So now, just as a final thing, let's print out the areas of these circles. Actually, what we should do here is use the other constructor here. So we're going to pass in a value of, I don't know, 14.3. So the first time we create a circle, we're going to use the default constructor, this one here, and the second time through, we're going to use this constructor where we're defining the radius for our circle. So now let's print out the areas. So system.out.println, the area of C1 is C1.getArea. Now, because getArea is an instance method, we have the variable name dot method name, whereas with the static method, we had circle2, the class name, dot method name. So we've printed out the area of C1. Let's also print out the area of C2. So I'll just copy and paste this. And we're ready to go. So let's run this and see what happens. So run as Java application. Okay, so you can see the first time through, when we printed out the number of objects, it was 0 because we haven't created any objects yet. So next we created an object, and when we printed it out, there was one object. So you can see here that the constructor incremented number of objects, so now it was equal to 1. So next we created another object and printed it out, and it was equal to 2. This is because this is a static variable, which means there's only one copy of it no matter how many objects we've created. So the first time through, C1 incremented this, and then the second time through, C2 incremented it, but it incremented the same variable. So finally, we printed out the area of C1, which was just equal to pi, because the radius was equal to 1. And then the area of C2 was this number here, which was completely different. And we can do that because radius was an instance variable, so each object had its own copy of it. So with that, that's really all there is to this video. So quickly to summarize, instance variables belong to the object. Each object gets its own copy of the variable. For example, each circle had its own radius. Each object that we created had its own radius. Static variables are shared between all the objects of a class, so only one copy of the variable, no matter how many objects we've created, or even if we haven't created any objects yet. So in our class here, we had a static variable that counted the number of objects. So with that, that's it for this video.